The story does not begin with fireworks or noise. It begins with a hush, a stillness that lingers in the corners of a winter night, the kind of silence that carries something more than quiet. Morty lay in his bed, eyes tracing shadows that stretched along the ceiling, feeling that silence in his chest. It wasn't the usual hum of a house or the faint rattle of pipes. It was deeper, steadier, like a heartbeat coming from far away but close enough to reach him. He didn't know if it was inside him or outside. He only knew it was there. The world around him seemed ordinary enough. The smell of dust, the soft weight of his blanket, the faint glow of streetlights sneaking through the blinds, yet something felt different tonight, as though the walls themselves were breathing, as though the house was alive with secrets it had been holding back. Morty shifted, trying to ignore it, but the sound did not leave. The whisper grew fainter, softer, until it was no longer a sound at all, but a feeling pressed against the back of his mind. In that quiet, he thought of Rick. His grandfather always seemed to know more than he should, to hear signals others ignored, to read patterns in chaos. Morty wondered if Rick could hear this too, this low humming strangeness that felt at once comforting and unsettling. Rick would probably call it nothing, maybe laugh, maybe turn it into a joke about brainwaves or digestive cycles. But Morty knew better. He knew when something wasn't just noise. This felt alive. Sometimes the smallest things change everything. A flicker in the corner of your eye, a sound you can't explain, a moment too odd to be ignored. Morty felt the air around him hold its breath, weighty, tried to settle back down. Tried to pull the blanket tighter, but curiosity does not sleep easily. The whisper was not a warning, not yet. It was an invitation, subtle and steady, a pull towards something hidden beneath the ordinary. He sat up, listening harder. The sound was gone now, or maybe it was inside him all along, blending with his own heartbeat. He let out a breath he didn't know he was holding, a soft sigh that seemed to answer the silence. The room felt heavy, and yet light, as if the world itself had tilted towards something new. Morty lay back again, but his eyes stayed open, wide and wondering. The whisper lingered, not in his ears, but in the corners of his thoughts. He didn't know it yet, but the sound would lead him somewhere vast, somewhere hidden, somewhere waiting inside the folds of flesh and mystery. And in that moment, beneath the stillness of night, the first threads of the story began to weave themselves into place. It began like slipping into a dream that was not his own. One moment, Morty was listening to the whisper in the walls, and the next, he was pulled into a place where the air pulsed like a living breath. The world opened around him, not with the cold geometry of machines or the sharp edges of cities, but with the softness of flesh, the glow of tissue, the delicate shimmer of light playing across surfaces that seemed both strange and familiar. It wasn't frightening the way he expected. It was strangely calm, as though this hidden world had been waiting quietly, patient and alive, for someone to notice it. He stood at the edge of a vast chamber that pulsed like the inside of a heartbeat, walls glowing faintly with warmth, rivers of blood moving with unhurried rhythm, carrying their quiet cargo through a landscape that felt less like anatomy and more like an ancient garden. Strange structures rose like monuments, veins winding like bridges, organs looming like temples, each alive with their own quiet work. Morty could feel the hum of it all around him, the way every small detail contributed to the larger whole. It was surreal, yes, but it was also gentle, almost tender. Here, inside Reuben, the body was not just a body, it was an ecosystem, a living story written in red and gold. Tiny sparks of life moved along the pathways, some rushing, some drifting, all bound to their purpose. Morty walked carefully, as if afraid his footsteps might disturb the balance. There was no violence here, no chaos, only the slow rhythm of existence, steady and sure, like the lull of waves against a shore. He remembered Rick's voice, always cynical, always sharp, but now it echoed faintly in his mind. "Everything's a system, Morty, you just have to learn to read it." And here, inside this surreal park of tissue and thought, Morty began to see what Rick meant. Every flicker of light, every contraction, every soft movement worked in harmony, a secret order hidden within chaos. It wasn't grotesque, it was beautiful, in a way that caught Morty's breath and held it there. He reached out, brushing his fingers lightly against a wall of living tissue, and it responded with a ripple, like water touched by moonlight. The contact filled him with something unexpected, a warmth, a reminder that life itself was not just survival, but connection. This place was alive, and in some way it recognized him. He stood still, letting the moment wash over him, letting the strangeness feel less like alien ground and more like a quiet invitation. In the distance, the faint outlines of something more deliberate began to appear, structures that did not grow naturally, but were built, shaped by human hands. The soft pulse of the body met with the sharp edges of invention, and Morty realized this wasn't just a body, it was something else. A park, hidden in the folds of flesh, constructed not out of reverence but out of curiosity, perhaps greed, perhaps ambition. And yet even here there was wonder, even here the air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for him to understand. Morty took another step forward, feeling the ground beneath him pulse with life, hearing the slow murmur of blood moving like rivers through unseen channels. It was not loud, not frightening, it was steady, like a lullaby sung in the language of cells and veins. He knew then that this was only the beginning, that what lay ahead was more than just science or strangeness. It was a journey into the quiet heart of something vast, where every whisper of tissue carried a story waiting to unfold. The first steps were the hardest, not because the path was difficult, but because every movement carried the weight of uncertainty. Morty felt the living floor shift gently beneath him, each step accompanied by the soft pulse of a heartbeat that was not his own. The air was warm, scented faintly with something he could not name, something both comforting and unsettling, like the memory of a place he had never been. He glanced around, eyes wide, unsure whether to marvel or recoil, caught between awe and unease. The deeper he moved into the park, the more the strangeness revealed itself. Pathways lined with cartilage curved like natural corridors, and tiny sparks of bioluminescence glowed along the edges, guiding him forward like lanterns in the night. Strange structures rose above him, rib-like arches, chambers that echoed with hollow reverberations, soft currents of air flowing like whispers through unseen vents. Everything around him was alive, and yet shaped by human hands into something resembling a destination. He could not decide if it was sacred or profane. His unease pressed against his wonder, making each new sight feel fragile. A cluster of cells swirled like dancers in a pool of light, their movement hypnotic, their purpose unreadable. Morty stood still, entranced, feeling as though he was intruding upon a ritual too ancient for him to understand. He tried to remind himself that Rick had done this before, that it was only science, only another one of his grandfather's endless experiments. And yet, Morty could not quiet the ache inside him, the awareness that he was small here, a visitor in a world that did not belong to him. He thought of his own body, how it was both ordinary and mysterious, how it carried him each day without his notice. To stand here, within someone else's living frame, was to feel humbled in a way he could not put into words. The heartbeat that echoed faintly through the walls became a lull, reminding him that life was fragile and vast, and always working in silence. It was strange to be both fascinated and afraid, to feel reverence for a place that also unsettled him deeply. Further ahead, Morty noticed faint traces of construction rails curving through tissue, platforms anchored to bone, signs of human design clinging precariously to organic foundation. The artificial and the natural met uneasily, like two voices singing in different keys. He could feel the conflict of it in his chest. Part of him wanted to turn back, to escape the strangeness before it grew heavier. Yet another part of him, quiet, stubborn, needed to keep walking, needed to know what lay deeper, even if the knowing would unsettle him more. As he moved on, the lights dimmed, and the path narrowed into a tunnel that seemed to breathe with its own rhythm. Each inhale and exhale was a reminder that he was inside something alive, something far larger than himself. Morty placed his hand against the wall, feeling the slow expansion, the contraction, the steady proof of existence. For a moment, he closed his eyes, letting the sensation sink into him. It was not only strange, it was intimate. When he opened his eyes again, he realized that the wonder he felt was not simple curiosity. It was something deeper, something fragile, almost mournful. The thought came unbidden, soft as a whisper. Everything inside was working so hard. Yet Reuben, the man outside, would never know it. He would never see the silent beauty of his own body carrying him, never marvel at the quiet ecosystem that sustained him. And Morty, standing there in awe, could feel the ache of that truth. He pressed forward, guided by the glow of distant lights and the soft hum of life that surrounded him. The unease did not vanish, but it softened, blending with his wonder into something that felt almost like gratitude. He did not yet know where this path would lead, only that he could not stop now. The park stretched deeper, waiting, alive with secrets, and Morty carried them all within his quiet, uneasy heart. With Annie by his side, Morty began to notice more than just the oddities of flesh and architecture. Beneath every step, beneath every glance upward, there was a rhythm. It was not mechanical, nor was it artificial. It was alive, deep and steady, like the echo of a giant drum hidden under the ground. At first it unsettled him, a reminder that they were not walking through stone halls or constructed tunnels, but through the fragile body of a man. Yet as he listened closer, it softened into something more, a heartbeat, patient and constant, a reminder that even the strangest world had a pulse that tethered it to life. Annie seemed to hear it too. She paused once, laying her hand against a warm wall, closing her eyes as if to catch the cadence more clearly. Morty followed her lead, hesitant, but when he pressed his palm to the soft surface, he felt it thump, pause, thump. It was frightening, but it was also grounding. They were small figures moving through something immense, yet the pulse did not rush or strain. It carried on, indifferent yet strangely protective, as though the whole park were breathing with them. As they moved deeper, Morty realized the heartbeat was not just sound, but sensation. It traveled through the floor, through the air, even through the faint lights that glowed and dimmed in a slow rhythm. The park itself seemed alive, not only because of the bizarre rides and living structures, but because it truly was alive, holding them within its fragile body. Life was everywhere, resilient, persistent, delicate. For Morty, this awareness stirred both unease and wonder. He thought of how easy it was for something so vast to collapse, for a single weakness to undo everything. Yet he also thought of how much strength it took for the body to keep going, to beat on quietly without recognition. Maybe that was what made it beautiful, the balance of fragility and endurance, existing side by side. He walked a little slower, breathing in rhythm with the pulse, feeling himself soften into it. Annie didn't speak, but her quiet presence echoed the same realization. The park was more than a curiosity. It was a reminder. Life, no matter how strange, was still life, and every beat was a gift. The further Morty walked, the more the passages began to change. They were no longer just hallways of tissue and faint light. They seemed to bend in ways that stirred something deeper inside him, as though the walls themselves carried echoes of his own thoughts. Every step forward felt strangely like a step backward too, into places he had almost forgotten. The pulse of the park guided him, steady as before, but now it was joined by whispers he could not name. He remembered being very small, lying awake at night with shadows bending across his bedroom wall. He remembered clutching a blanket so tight his fingers ached, telling himself he wasn't afraid, even though he was. The tunnels pressed close in a similar way, not frightening exactly, but intimate, drawing out fears that had once been so enormous. He saw them now with different eyes, how fragile they had been, how they had shaped him without his knowing. Annie walked beside him in silence, her gaze soft, as though she too was caught in her own drifting recollections. Morty didn't need to ask. He understood that these tunnels belonged to more than the body they were inside. They belonged to memory itself, to the things everyone carried, small kindnesses that lingered, old fears that softened but never vanished, moments that seemed too small to matter yet stayed anyway. Morty thought of his mother's voice, of the way she once tucked him in after he'd had a nightmare, her hand resting on his hair until his breathing steadied. He thought of Rick too, chaotic, careless, often cruel, but sometimes unexpectedly gentle in ways Morty could never predict. He thought of himself, always trying to keep up, always trying to be more than just a scared kid caught in someone else's world. These memories did not hurt, they simply existed, stitched into him like threads he could never untangle. As the tunnels widened, Morty realized the journey wasn't only through Ruben's body, it was through the body of his own life, layer by layer, moment by moment. And as unsettling as that was, it was also comforting. The things he carried, the fears, the kindnesses, the quiet little truths, were not weights pulling him down. They were what kept him moving, even when the world made no sense. The heartbeat returned, steady and low, guiding him forward, as if to say, remember, carry it all, but don't be afraid. The tunnels seemed endless, folding into themselves like thoughts Morty couldn't quite finish. Just as the silence grew heavy enough to make him wonder if he'd lost his way, Rick's voice cracked through the air, thin and wavering, like a signal caught between stations. It wasn't loud, it wasn't steady, but it was there, half a mutter, half a joke, threaded with a weight Morty had come to recognize. "Don't get lost in the guts, Morty," Rick's voice said, crackling as though it was made of static and breath. "Places like this, they remember you more than you remember them." Morty stopped walking. Annie glanced at him confused, but he didn't explain. He only listened, straining for more. Rick's words weren't directions. Not really. They felt more like lanterns in the dark, flickers of warmth that guided without promising safety. Every phrase carried that odd balance. Rick always held care disguised as sarcasm, wisdom tangled with weariness. "Thing about bodies, Morty," the voice went on, "is they're just temporary maps, but the real stuff, the imprints, they hang around, even in places you don't think they should." He coughed, then muttered something unintelligible, before returning with a laugh that didn't sound quite like a laugh. Morty wanted to answer, to call out, but he couldn't tell if Rick would hear him. It was like listening to someone through a dream. You knew they were close, yet untouchable. The words clung to him, though, lighting the passage enough that he felt steady again. He thought about what Rick meant, about how every corridor here seemed to echo with something more than muscle and blood. Maybe the tunnels weren't just Ruben's. Maybe they were everyone's, built from all the memories and all the care people leave behind. Annie touched his arm gently, grounding him. "Who are you hearing?" she whispered, her voice softer than the walls around them. Morty didn't answer, but the warmth of her presence filled the silence between Rick's flickering words. The voice returned once more, quieter now. "Keep moving, Morty. It's never as dark as it feels." Then it faded, slipping back into static, leaving only the steady pulse of the park and Morty's own heartbeat rising to meet it. The tunnels seemed endless, folding into themselves like thoughts Morty couldn't quite finish. Just as the silence grew heavy enough to make him wonder if he'd lost his way, Rick's voice cracked through the air, thin and wavering, like a signal caught between stations. It wasn't loud, it wasn't steady, but it was there, half a mutter, half a joke, threaded with a weight Morty had come to recognize. "Don't get lost in the guts, Morty," Rick's voice said, crackling as though it was made of static and breath. "Places like this, they remember you more than you remember them." Morty stopped walking. Annie glanced at him, confused, but he didn't explain. He only listened, straining for more. Rick's words weren't directions, not really. They felt more like lanterns in the dark, flickers of warmth that guided without promising safety. Every phrase carried that odd balance Rick always held, care disguised as sarcasm, wisdom tangled with weariness.
"Thing about bodies, Morty," the voice went on, "is they're just temporary maps. But the real stuff, the imprints, they hang around, even in places you don't think they should." He coughed, then muttered something unintelligible, before returning with a laugh that didn't sound quite like a laugh. Morty wanted to answer, to call out, but he couldn't tell if Rick would hear him. It was like listening to someone through a dream. You knew they were close, yet untouchable. The words clung to him, though, lighting the passage enough that he felt steady again. He thought about what Rick meant, about how every corridor here seemed to echo with something more than muscle and blood. Maybe the tunnels weren't just Reuben's. Maybe they were everyone's, built from all the memories and all the care people leave behind. Annie touched his arm gently, grounding him. "Who are you hearing?" she whispered, her voice softer than the walls around them. Morty didn't answer, but the warmth of her presence filled the silence between Rick's flickering words. The voice returned once more, quieter now. "Keep moving, Morty. It's never as dark as it feels." Then it faded, slipping back into static, leaving only the steady pulse of the park and Morty's own heartbeat rising to meet it. The air shifted as Morty and Annie moved forward, the tunnels no longer steady but alive with an unease that seeped through every surface. The glow that once felt like warmth now wavered with a darker pulse, as though Reuben's body had grown restless in its sleep. Morty could feel it, the way the space tightened, the way the blood hummed faster, thick with something unspoken. It wasn't a monster or a trap that loomed, but something quieter, heavier, the reminder that bodies wear down, that life itself is a fragile agreement written in tissue and breath. Everywhere he looked, shadows stirred inside the bloodstream, not with teeth or claws, but with a truth Morty couldn't run from. The park's walls trembled with soft spasms, capillaries straining, tiny red cells drifting like lost lanterns in a flood. Annie whispered that the body was turning, slipping towards sickness. But Morty barely heard her. He was listening instead to the silence beneath it, the kind that carried inevitability. For the first time, the wonder he'd felt walking through this strange place became tinged with sorrow. To be inside a body was to witness its limits. To be alive was to already be losing time. He thought about how quickly joy can pass, how even laughter leaves behind echoes that fade into stillness. His chest ached, not from fear, but from knowing how delicate everything truly was. A sudden tremor ran through the ground, and Morty stumbled, catching himself against the wall. The tissue beneath his hand pulsed weakly, then shuddered like it might tear. Annie steadied him, her eyes wide, but she didn't speak. They both knew what it meant. The park was unraveling, Reuben's body yielding to what no science or invention could fully resist. Morty thought of Rick's voice, faint and flickering. "It's never as dark as it feels." But standing there, surrounded by the failing rhythm of a body, Morty understood the deeper meaning. Darkness wasn't always sharp or sudden. Sometimes
It was just the slow folding of light, the quiet truth that every heartbeat was both a beginning and an ending. He pressed on, not with courage, but with the fragile acceptance that life itself was made of shadows. The air inside Reuben's body felt heavier now, as though each pulse of blood carried not just life but also a soft reminder of its fragility. Morty walked close to Annie, not because he needed to, but because something in him longed for the nearness of another heartbeat. The strange lights of Anatomy Park flickered above them, casting shifting patterns across her face, and in those shadows Morty found a kind of steadiness that words could never give. Their voices fell away into silence, but the silence was not empty. It was woven with glances that lingered too long. The brush of her hand when they steadied themselves, the quiet rhythm of two people learning how to survive by simply staying close. Morty didn't know how to name it, this fragile connection that made the tunnels feel less lonely, but he could feel it shaping him in ways deeper than he could admit. Annie, too, seemed to understand without speaking, her eyes carrying the same unspoken truth. In a place where everything could fall apart at any moment, what mattered was not escape, but the warmth of being seen. Together, they moved forward, not as explorers or survivors, but as two fragile souls, carrying one another through the trembling body of a world that might not last. The quiet bond between Morty and Annie carried them only so far before the world around them began to shift in ways that could not be ignored. Anatomy Park trembled, not with sudden disaster, but with the heavy inevitability of a body finally giving in. Walls that once seemed alive with color dulled, their glow dimming like the last embers of a fading fire. The steady pulse that had guided them now staggered, uneven, reminding Morty that every system, no matter how strong, eventually surrenders. He felt it not as panic, but as a slow ache, the understanding that they were walking through the unraveling of something larger than themselves. Annie's hand brushed his again, grounding him as the structures groaned, and tissues began to sag, not in violence but in weariness. Reuben's body was failing, and with it, the fragile amusement of the park gave way to something solemn, almost sacred, the collapse of life itself, drawn out in echoes and silence. Morty held his breath, as if his small act of stillness might preserve it a little longer, though deep inside he knew that endings are never stopped, only witnessed. The trembling walls of Reuben's body shivered like a farewell, each pulse weaker, each breath more distant. Morty held Annie's gaze, and in her eyes he saw the unspoken truth. She did not belong beyond this place. Their bond had been carved in the fragile marrow of fear and wonder, yet it could not be carried out into the wider world. A silence hung between them, not empty but tender, as if the park itself conspired to grant them one last pause. Morty wanted to cling, to promise something lasting, but the moment was too honest for lie. She smiled softly, the kind that accepts endings without bitterness, and her hand lingered in his just long enough to remind him that love, even when fleeting, leaves its mark. Then as the structures around them dissolved, Annie faded into the tremor of the body's surrender, and Morty felt the ache of knowing that some connections are meant only to be felt, not kept. Rick's voice crackled through the comms, sharp and impatient, detailing cellular collapse and systemic failure with his usual harsh certainty. To Morty, the words were a storm of science, but beneath the clinical edges, something else stirred, a quiet reverence woven into Rick's tone. He spoke of entropy as inevitable, of bodies as temporary vessels that burn bright before fading. Yet in the rhythm of his explanation, Morty caught the shimmer of awe. Even in decay, Rick implied, there was beauty, the strange fleeting elegance of systems giving way. Morty listened, torn between grief and wonder, realizing that his grandfather's cynicism was not emptiness but a shield, and within it pulsed a truth too fragile to say aloud, that endings are not failures, only the natural curve of existence. The vibrations lessened until they were barely there, a faint shiver beneath Morty's feet that slowed, weakened, and then almost stilled. The chambers that once roared with life grew hushed, their colors dimming like light retreating from a room. Around him, the park folded inward, pathways narrowing, structures collapsing gently, as if weary of holding on. Morty felt the air shift, thinning, quieter, until every breath seemed borrowed. Then came the final release, a long, fragile exhale that carried no violence, only surrender. In that silence, Morty understood the vast, pulsing world he had walked through was not disappearing, but closing, tucking itself away into memory. What remained was the echo of footsteps, the weight of connection, and the delicate truth that even endings leave something behind. Stepping back into the cool air outside, Morty carried with him the hush of a world that had folded away. The stars stretched wide above, silent and endless, yet they seemed closer now, like watchful eyes that knew secrets he could barely hold. His chest felt heavy, not with fear but with the echo of loss, a reminder that even in fleeting moments, love and wonder had pressed against him, leaving marks that would not fade. Annie's face lingered in memory, Reuben's body a quiet vessel of impermanence. The park a dream dissolving into silence. Morty tilted his head toward the sky, realizing that life, however fragile, carried its meaning in the briefness. Astonishing because it ended, precious because it could not be kept. And in that fragile truth, he felt both smaller and somehow more alive. And so the silence gathers, not as an ending but as a soft turning of the page. Reuben's body lies quiet, Annie's fleeting warmth lingers, like a breath against the heart. Rick's muttered wisdom drifts half-forgotten yet enduring, and Morty's ache folds itself into the fabric of growing. These pieces do not vanish. They settle, becoming the quiet matter of legend, the fragments of dream that return in moments of stillness. The story does not close, it simply leans back into the dark, into the spaces between stars, where memory hums and love refuses to fade. Rest comes gently here, not as loss but as keeping, the assurance that what was felt continues, softened, eternal.